Jackson retires in 1837. He's the most beloved political figure of his time. He is truly a giant and widely admired by the population. But Jackson will leave kind of a mess in his wake. The sale of Western lands was so profitable that we paid off all of our debt. 1837 is the only time in American history where we have no debt, and we did this by selling the land out west. The surplus is given back to the states. So we take all the extra money the government takes in taxes, and we give it to the states. The states will spend it on internal improvements. They'll build roads and things like this. But we take it out of those pet banks. Remember, Jackson had pulled the money out of the Bank of the United States and put it into pet banks. When we pull the money out of the pet banks to give it back to the state governments, the pet banks don't have enough money. These are small state banks. And so they begin calling in their loans. You had a loan for 5 more years. They say you have to pay it off right away. When they begin calling in loans, it becomes very difficult to loan money, and it leads to a credit crunch. It becomes very hard to get loans. Congress ignores this problem. They do nothing. Jackson, fearing that the value of the money will collapse, will issue something called the Specie Circular in 1836. And this says that only gold and silver can be used to buy federal land. Now that gold and silver can do things that paper money can't, no one wants paper money, and so paper money loses its value. And as Jackson is leaving office, he sends the country into a 5-year economic depression. The economy falls apart. A lot of the improvement projects that the states were spending that extra money on stop in the middle of the job. And even though America had paid off all its debts, some states have to go into default, meaning they can no longer pay their debts. So Van Buren comes into the White House as the economy is falling apart, and the things Van Buren will do will actually make the economy much worse. He borrows money to pay off the government debt. Now, when he borrows money, remember, the problem is there's not enough money to borrow. Well, when the government borrows money, it becomes a competitor with other people who want to borrow money, and now there's even less money to borrow. As the paper money loses its value, Van Buren says that all your taxes now have to be paid in gold or silver. Well, the problem is people can't get their hands on gold and silver to begin with, so now people can't pay their taxes. Congress tries to lower the price of land out west to encourage expansion out there and maybe some economic growth, but it can't get the bill through Congress. In 1837, Van Buren proposes creating an independent treasury, and it says American money will be held in treasuries throughout the U.S. and not be available for loaning out our investment. In 1840, this passes. But now that the government won't loan you any money, the money supply is even smaller, it's even harder to get a loan, and the economy gets even worse. The economy is not recovered by 1840 when Van Buren tries to get reelected. The Whigs will not get behind Henry Clay, and instead will support William Henry Harrison. Clay is associated with the bank, which is associated with economic collapse, and so he's lost most of his popularity. Media has evolved. Now we have what's called a penny press, which are newspapers that sell for a penny. And for the first time, regular people are getting a daily dose of news. And these newspapers aren't what you call news. They're all partisan. They're all trying to get you to vote for one candidate or the other. And so the election is incredibly sensationalist. The first one of these, by the way, is the New York Sun, published in 1833. Both parties claim to be the party of the common man. The Whigs are trying to steal this identity from the Democrats. The Democrats actually are the party of the common man. But the Whigs know that you can't run as the party of the elites. Nobody's going to vote for that. But image trumps substance. Philosophy, what they're each going to do if they get elected, is irrelevant. It's all about what kind of guy is Van Buren and what kind of guy is William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison is actually a large plantation owner from Virginia, and he's one of the wealthiest men in the western part of the country. But in his campaign, he's portrayed as a great war hero and is kind of a Daniel Boone character, a guy who just sits on the front porch of his log cabin and drinks hard cider like the rest of you. That's completely untrue, but that's the way they sell him. That's the story they tell about him. Now, the Whigs have never won an election. The Democrats are by far the more popular party. So, in order to try to get Democratic supporters, Harrison will turn to a former Democrat who had gotten in like a personal fight with the leader of the Democratic Party named John Tyler. And they run as a unity ticket, one Whig, one Democrat. Putting Tyler, the disgruntled Democrat, on the ticket with him, William Henry Harrison will give us probably the second most famous slogan in American political history, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. As you see there on the poster, Tippecanoe, a reference to the battle Harrison won against the Native Americans back in the war, right before the War of 1812. The most famous slogan in campaign history is Martin Van Buren's, although nobody knows that. Kids at the time around New York City would misspell words on purpose and then use the first initials of those words. So something people do today, kids do today, misspell words on purpose and then abbreviate things by their first letters. Think about text messaging. Kids in New York would say all correct, O-L-L-K-O-R-E-K-T. And William Van Buren's nickname was Old Kinderhook. He was from the town of Kinderhook. And everybody was old something or another back then. Jackson was Old Hickory, for example. And so Martin Van Buren slogan became, in New York anyway, okay is okay. So Old Kinderhook, Martin Van Buren, is all correct in the language of the kids. And this took this phrase okay and put it into our language, and that's actually where okay comes from, which of course we still use today frequently. The economic collapse is more than Van Buren can overcome, and William Henry Harrison easily wins election, and the Whigs have their first president. The problem is, William Henry Harrison he's the second oldest man ever elected president, the oldest at the time. Reagan is the first. He turns out to make the bad decision of giving his inaugural address outside in the rain and speaking for over 3 hours. He catches pneumonia and dies in 30 days. So the Whigs finally get the White House, and their president only lasts 30 days. Now, nobody knows what to do. Now, you think, obviously, then the vice president becomes president, but that wasn't understood at the time. The Constitution simply says that the vice president will assume the duties of the president. It doesn't make it clear whether or not there should be another election or whether that guy gets to stand there for the entire 4 years. And to make this even more complicated, the vice president is a Democrat. It's, of course, John Tyler, and he doesn't really agree with the Whigs' policies. What he does next is pretty amazing. He tells the cabinet that Harrison has selected, all the Whigs who are supposed to advise the president, he tells them that if they support him being president, he'll keep them around. And then he tells the Democrats, hey, man, I agree with you guys, so you should support me being president because I think the same way that you do. Well, both sides agree that he should be president, even though most of the country assumes there's going to be a new election, like immediately have an election to pick a new president and get rid of Tyler. But by kind of making this deal and leading both sides on, he's able to gain support. And now on, from then on, every time a president dies, there's no question. The vice president just becomes president. Now, Tyler then turns around to his cabinet. They had been under the impression that the cabinet would vote on every policy, and however the cabinet voted, that's what the president would do. And Tyler tells them, no. You can vote however you want. I'm going to do what I want to do. And so they quit, all the Whigs. And he turns to the Democrats and he says, hey, do you want all these cabinet jobs? And they say, you're really shady, dude. We don't trust you. And so Tyler ends up being the only president in American history without a party. He's actually going to be fairly important. He raises tariffs. He refuses Henry Clay's attempt to recharter the bank. He vetoes bills to spend federal money on internal improvements. He has to create a new power base. He doesn't have Whig support. He doesn't have Democratic support. And so what he does is he creates a power base of Southern plantation owners, large slaveholders, including people like John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. And it will be John Tyler that will turn the Whigs into the party of slavery. Before slavery had existed, or support for slavery had existed, both among Whigs and Democrats. But with Tyler, the Democrats will clearly be the party that supports slavery. His foreign policy is important too. Once again, we're looking like we might be moving towards war with Great Britain. In 1837, Canadians rebel against the British government, and we supply the Canadians with weapons so they can fight against the British. A U.S. citizen is killed when one of our supply ships that's supplying the Canadians is burnt. We actually go to war with some Canadian farmers, or I say a border dispute in Maine, trying to decide where the border between Canada and America is. This is called the Aroostook War. In 1841, a slave ship called the Creole, the slaves rebel and seize control of the ship. They sail to the Bahamas, which is controlled by Great Britain, and the British allow the slaves to come there and be freed. But we're very angry about this. And so we begin talking about going to war with Britain over these issues, the Canadian rebellion, and then this slave ship that gets freed by the British. Britain doesn't want a war, and so they agree to the Ashburton Treaty of 1842. They apologize to us. They give us the border settlement we want in Maine, and a third war with Britain is narrowly averted. In 1844, then the Treaty of Wanghua, we open up trade with China on the same terms that Great Britain has trade with China, which will be very important in the future. But we're beginning to become a world power in terms of trade. Overall, John Tyler is a disaster for the Whigs. Even though he is technically elected as a Whig, he's really a Democrat, and he doesn't do hardly anything the Whigs want done. So the Whigs, after losing presidential election after presidential election, when they finally win, it turns out to be a loss too.